Today, we are going to talk about one of the greatest literary geniuses, one could say, among the Assyrians, certainly an activist, Addai Alkhas, Rabbi Addai Alkhas, um, who was born in 1897 and passed away in 1959. And it's important to know Addai Alkhas. I'm going to save my analysis, although I'll make references at various times to the importance of his work and the publications that came out through his efforts, along, of course, with the efforts of his brother John Alkhas and the great Nimrod Simono, the grammarian and writer and historian, Assyrian writers, all three, of course, from Iran. He was born in 1896 in Urmi to an Assyrian family, originally from Salamas. He studied in Catholic schools in Urmi. He was a Catholic. He was sent to Khosrawa in Salamas to continue his education. There he studied Assyrian, French, Latin. He studied philosophy and theology. He taught in Urmi and in Tabriz later. He is, of course, also known as the father of the great artist Hannibal Alkhas and also poet, and the brother of the person who is often lauded as having no equal in Assyrian poetry, and that is John Alkhas. So he is the brother of John Alkhas, and we will be taking up John Alkhas next week. He worked in, like many Assyrians, worked different. He was in a different profession the than his involvement in Assyrian affairs. In other words, this was not his full-time position running various literary enterprises. He was finally laid to rest on January 15, 1959. He was 63 years of age. Why is he important? And I'm going to I'll save my analysis, I should say, and final commentary at the end. But in 1951, he founded a new printing house named Hunain, after the Assyrian translator of Greek science into classical Syriac or Assyrian, and then into Arabic, well known as one of the founders, one could say, of the Islamic Golden Age. In 1952, he started a new literary periodical, Gilgamesh, which continued to run until 1961, so close to 10 years. Lauded as the greatest literary production since 1845 by Nimrod Simono. And Nimrod Simono knows of what he speaks because Nimrod Simono is a grammarian and one of the greatest writers among Assyrians in the modern age. It became what one Semiticist said was a literary tribune for Assyrian writers, not only for Iran, but also in the whole world. And Gilgamesh, of course, traveled from Iran to Iraq, to Australia, to the United States, and to other places where Assyrians were living. Now, since we're talking about Assyrianism and the formation of these ideas that laid the groundwork, one could say, for our understanding today of our continuity with ancient Assyrians, for example, we have to refer to some of the writers, theoretical thinkers among or within the field of nationalism. And so one of those that is helpful to understand. He's a good guide to understanding these developments is Benedict Anderson. Benedict Anderson speaks of an imagined political community and imagined both as inherently limited and sovereign. Why is it imagined? It is because the members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, meet them, or even hear of them. Yet in their minds, in the minds of each lives the image of their communion. What does that mean? And through understanding the production of Gilgamesh and the efforts of men like Addai, Alkhas, Nimrod Simono, and John Alkhas, we will find out what exactly Anderson is talking about. So let's understand his view on the importance of literature within the formation of Assyrianism. The rise of print capitalism, he calls it print capitalism, through the proliferation, of books and newspapers or magazines such as Gilgamesh, enabled people to imagine a shared community. And I will refer to this. When Assyrians began to see images of the ancient past, really for, I would say, the first time in this particular magazine, and next to words in the Assyrian language, it formed an indelible mark in their minds, and they associated these images with themselves. Print media standardized languages and disseminated ideas and stories that fostered a sense of shared identity and history. Uniformity for a dispersed people is the way that I put it, because as the Assyrians were dispersed all over the world, it was very important for them to have something in common, something that tied them together, especially if it was rooted deep in the past. Stories, by depicting a shared social reality, allowed readers to imagine the daily lives of fellow citizens, reinforcing the sense of a common national identity. Again, we referred in the past to this attempt to rise above the denominationalism that was very divisive, as perceived by the nationalists, especially in the early years in Urmia, by writers like Benjamin Arsanis, who also, by the way, has contributed to Gilgamesh before his passing in 1957. This attempt to rise above denominationalism is supported by the reference to the ancient Assyrian past. So let's not go back to the divisions between the Church of the East and the Catholic Church, or the Chaldean Church and the Syriac Orthodox. Let's go to a past that puts us all together and allows us to share in this culture and these images. And Gilgamesh magazine put forth these very important, very resonating images of the ancient Assyrian past, and we'll have a look at them very carefully as the slides are shown. So Assyrian history becomes a social anchor of sorts, and this is very important, again, for the rise above the denominationalism that Assyrians were facing. Remember also that one could say, for example, we haven't quite triumphed over the denominationalism that that we experience up until today. For example, Assyrians call themselves with different denominational names and so on and so forth, and they do not associate with each other because of this division. So we haven't quite overcome it. Nevertheless, the production that Addai Alkhas, who was a member of the Catholic faith, was involved in, was to try to take Assyrians back to this glorious heritage, to this anchor, social anchor that tied us all together, regardless or despite our differences in the various denominations that we have. So this created the sameness of experience among many Assyrians by synchronizing lives of readers through shared news, events, and public discourse. So all Assyrians come together, they read this important magazine, they see the same images of the ancient past, they begin to understand certain words, and they associate themselves all together. It's as if they are taking a kind of communion in the words of Benedict Anderson. So the literary contribution that Gilgamesh made to Assyrianism, the use of epics, the use of poems, novels or short stories and plays that highlight a shared Assyrian past, common values, and a collective destiny. And you see here this image, which keeps repeating in the various issues, an image of the ancient Assyrian past, motifs of the ancient Assyrian past, the winged bulls, the Assyrian star, and then the words in modern Assyrian. And of course, you see there also at the bottom, cuneiform writing. Not that anyone can read it, I don't think, at the time, but it's important now that Assyrians are associating for the very first time these images with their own language. This is the very first time that we see such a concerted, consistent effort made by any Assyrian organization or individual to tie this Assyrian language, the modern Assyrian language, with these ancient images in the service of Assyrianism. Revived these writings revived historical memories, collective historical memories, of course, celebrated cultural uniqueness. We are a unique people, we are an ancient people, and inspired a collective sense of pride and belonging. Assyrians were, of course, again, dispersed all over the world. They were in Iran, Iraq, and Turkey, Syria, United States, Australia, so on and so forth. But they all tied themselves. They had a history, tied themselves to what I called this anchor, social anchor, this ancient and glorious history. Through literature, Assyrians articulate their aspirations, grievances, ideologies, rallying people to the cause of national survival, in the words of Benedict Anderson, and that leads to self-determination or is leading to self-determination. But in the case of Assyrians, to national survival, because the Assyrians were always insecure about surviving, having survived a traumatic experience, especially in the First World War, and being dispersed all over the world and losing their homeland, of course. So literary figures like Addai Alkhas, like Nimrod Simono, like John Alkhas, and others often become key players in nationalist movements or in Assyrianism, using their writings to mobilize support and articulate the vision of the nation to assure survival. We are here, we are strong, we are going to keep talking in this language, we are going to keep writing in this language, we are going to sing in this language, and by doing so, we will bring all of us together and we will survive as we know ourselves, the imagined community. Assyrian literature is fundamental to Assyrianism, in the words of Anderson. Literature, this is a paraphrasing of Anderson, literature through the medium of print was fundamental in the creation and spread of nationalist ideologies. By providing a shared narrative and a common language, literature helped individuals imagine themselves as part of a larger, cohesive community going back in time. This imagined solidarity laid the groundwork for the development of modern nation states, or in the example of the Assyrians, the nation itself dispersed without a state, and the powerful sense of national identity that accompanied it. Now, remember, I can't stress this point enough. The language that Assyrians were writing in was usually used for religious purposes. When the Americans and later the Russians and others came and produced periodicals like Zarir al-Bahra in the 1840s or Ormi Orthodoxeta or other magazines, it was in the service of the faith, the Christian faith. It was not in the service of nationalism. It was not in the service of Assyrianism. Certainly, it was not important to refer to the ancient past until Kichwa came. Kichwa, which was a periodical that was independent in 1906 in Urmia, was a very important vehicle for Assyrianism, but it certainly did not produce this association with the ancient past, the images, the writings, the deep storytelling, the poetry that Gilgamesh had. Now, also very important to know that we talk about a tradition and we talk about history. When tradition is weakened, according to Hobsbawm, or Hallbox, I'm sorry, when tradition is weakened, when it becomes dispersed and social memory fades, what is important is a new history that is emerging. And this is what we have today in Gilgamesh, not today in the 1950s, in the production of Gilgamesh, this recreation of a new, one could call it seems inappropriate, but it's a new history, a reinvention of the understanding of ancient Assyrian history. I use this quote here from someone who was giving me a compliment, but he said, I don't tell me what your grandfather told you. Don't tell me those stories. Give me real history. And in effect, this was what was happening in Gilgamesh magazine, although there is, of course, shared experience and memory, real memory, or memory as recollected, and we'll refer to that, by some of the writers in Gilgamesh, including Addai Alkhas. It's important to know the emphasis placed on this history that we can all share, which is the ancient Assyrian history. Now, the observations of Semiticist Rudolf Masuch, if I'm pronouncing his name correct, he tells us that there were missionary printing houses in Urmia before the end of the First World War. And of course, the war happened and we lost so much, not only in terms of lives and land and houses and churches and so on, but also the ability to print. And so he laments that a lot of the books that came out were only able to be printed years afterwards. So, for example, a book of poems, Kitawat Mshukhiate, written by Shimon Bardawat at Ada, was published in 1945, long after his death. He passed away in 1914. Heroic poem Ator Rapta, Great Assyria of Daud Gewergis Malik of Sapurgan. He passed away in 1931, and his poem was published in Beirut by Malik Qambar in 1932. A collection of nationalist poems by Shlimun of Salamas, who passed away in 1951. Sapar Dimma Urkhid Dimma, Sapar Damaib Urkhid Dimma, Journey of Tears on the Bloody Way, was published in Tehran in 1962. So all of these books were unable, or these manuscripts were unable to be accessible to the public because there was a lack of printing houses. And that is an effort that was undertaken after the First World War by the great Addai Alkhas and his brother John Alkhas. Now, with the founding of the magazine Gilgamesh, Addai Alkhas had in mind the recreation not only of history or the redoing of Assyrian history, but also to polish Assyrian writing and to bring together all the writers. This was a magazine that was published exclusively in the Assyrian language, so it was very important. As he tells us, we've thought for some time now that we should have a periodical in our own language to serve as a link tying together all literary abilities, kikra or msayate, within our nation. This will help preserve and strengthen our language, which is our heritage, yartutan, passed down from our ancestors, min awahatan. We may with pride preach to the world that its civilization had begun with us. writing on the tablets for thousands of years had been buried in the castles of their owners, have today risen from their graves and attest to this. So there is this rediscovery of our past, which brings us all together. Again, this rise above the denominations, which came later. Let's go reach into a deeper past, because that past is not only bringing us together, but it is also a glorious past. It is something that gives us, one could say, social wealth. Now, the team at Gilgamesh was made up largely, of course, primarily of Addai Alkhas, along with John Alkhas, his brother. And by the way, the name John Alkhas is sometimes written Jan instead of John, but I write it because it's the usual way that it is spelled is John. John Alkhas and Nimrod Simono. Addai Alkhas and John Alkhas both died, I would say, young, in the early 60s, and Nimrod Simono died later. In addition, Zaya bid Zaya played a very prominent role in a number of writings, which were very important, and no doubt they all cooperated together. This group succeeded in purifying modern Assyrian of various Turkish and Kurdish loanwords, replacing them through classical expressions, lishana atiqa or sapraya, creating, in the words of Rudolf Matsuch, an elegant literary language. Others contributed, of course, Mishael Butputros, Shmuel Betqolia, Shlimun Salamas, and others. In addition to the normal contents, a glossary was devoted to difficult words. So it's very important to show Assyrians khabre asqa, difficult words that you should learn as an Assyrian. So there are various entries in every single magazine in every one of these Gilgamesh periodicals that shows that tells us instead of using a simple word which is borrowed from either Turkish or Kurdish or whatever other foreign languages that Assyrians use, the original Syriac is used, or the more pure, one could say, word, in the words of Semiticist Masuch. The first issue, in addition, of course, to referring to the ancient past, there's also an attempt to link ancient Assyrian to also the Christian Assyrian past. And there's a reverence for certain men of religion, especially educated men of religion. For example, Paul Bejan, Martu Maodu, and others. There are praises of, in particular, Chaldean metropolitans of Urmia and Salamas who have a great deal of education, especially in Latin and French and so on, in addition to the Assyrian language. So here we see a prayer, one of the first, I would say, Assyrianists, and that is Martu Maodu. He asked, Lord of Lords, King of Kings, unchangeable and infinite, creator of all creations, knower of sources, Mabu'e, Allate, look with mercy upon our poor nation, pour mercy into the hearts or upon the hearts of those who hate it, Senyano, give blessings for our orchards, our kermane and fields, give us peace, serenity, and love for everyone and more for each other, give us a pure heart and bright mind and good order, give us strength and health, and so on. This was produced in the very first issue of Gilgamesh, and it is very significant because it ties those who love the ancient Assyrian past with also this religious past in the service of Assyrianism. So the contents of this magazine over a period of 9 years were, for example, the Epic of Enuma Elish, which is a very interesting tale of, and I'll refer to it, of creation for the Assyrian or Babylonian people, ancient Assyrian Babylonian people. By reproducing it, and within this tale, one hears words that one never knew before. So new terminologies, new words, new phrases, Ashur, Ishtar, Marduk, Tiamat, and so on and so forth. These were words to the common Assyrian, common modern Assyrian. They were not familiar with these words. Nobody ever said the word Marduk or Inlil or Tiamat now or Apsu. These are words that Addai Alkhas is teaching his people, along with, of course, John Alkhas and Nimrod Simono. Words and expressions in modern Assyrian language gave Assyrians a sense of their glorious history, gave them pride in their heritage. Constantly, there was a defense of this ancient Assyrian past. So it was never a critical look at the past. It was a very welcoming view of the past, a very laudatory view of the past. And constantly you see references to defending, and I'll give an example later on. So there was introduction to Assyrian and Babylonian history. Addai Alkhas, John Alkhas, Nimrod Simono, and Zaya Bidzaya were constantly writing in this magazine various tales, stories, epics, poetry, introduction of later epic tales such as Akhiq al-Hakima, Bar Ruel Muhatas, poems of experiences in the First World War, for example, Shlimun Salamas, children's poetry, news of Assyrians around the world, pride in students doing well, so announcements of certain students who came in their classes, in addition to going back into the past. So one of the articles by Nimrod Simono in this magazine in the very first issue is the Assyrian and Babylonian New Year. First time that this is mentioned in 1952. So those of you who are curious, where did this idea of Chab Nisan come from? This is the source of the idea of the Assyrian New Year. Now, I'm going to tell you what this says, and I'll tell you where the numbers came from. So in this article, Nimrod Simono goes over the story of the initiation and meaning of the Assyrian and Babylonian New Year. He compares the belief system of ancient Assyrians, and here he refers to them as Aturaye, to the belief system of modern Assyrians, Suraye or Asuriaye, with the alab, the missing alab, outlines the significance of various days and prayer rituals, and he compares the Assyrian prayers and rituals now with the past and says, look, there's a parallel here between both. Both are religious, both have an understanding, though he, of course, being a Christian, a devoted Christian, a believer, does not believe in the ancient religion, but he's trying to accurately portray it in the spirit of this new Assyrianism or rising Assyrianism. So he compares the religious beliefs of ones that came after, the faiths that came after. So he gives, for example, says there's the yin and the yang, there's this evil and good in the world. There is Marduk, who is good, or Ashur, and Tiamat, who is the representative of evil. There is Yahweh in the Bible and Satan, and there is Ahura Mazda and Nariman in Persian lore, and so on and so forth. So the ancient Assyrians, he tells us, were no different. Now, why is he saying this? It's important to know that because of the references, some of the derogatory references, I would not say all, but some of the derogatory references of the Old Testament to the Assyrians brought to mind for some Assyrians that their ancestors were a bit too evil for their tastes, perhaps. And so Nimrod Simono and Addai Alkhas and John Alkhas constantly have to be defending against these views by demonstrating the goodness, the glory, the perfection of the ancient Assyrians, our ancestors. And so he tells us at the end of this article, Nimrod Simono does in 1952, and so From various perspectives, we find that the ancient civilization of our forefathers remains a light, bahra, whose rays have not yet diminished. Zariro lena. So the rays of our ancient civilization have not diminished. We have not yet disappeared. Keep in mind also that among Western writers, especially at that time, and of course years afterwards, there was a lot of criticism of the fact that maybe Assyrians are not the descendants, modern Assyrians are not the descendants of the ancient Assyrians. And this was a view that, of course, Assyrianism wholeheartedly rejected through the writings of people like Naum Fayek, Ashir Yusuf, Benjamin Arsanis, Freydun Aturaya, and so many others. But this, for the first time, we see this terminology, this understanding, this opening up of our ancient culture and looking at it very carefully, looking at Assyrian faith, ancient Assyrian faith in a critical way. And then these images that are constantly popping up in this magazine of this ancient past, this ancient glorious past. So you see one of the pages here from 1952 of the Ishtar Gate, and you see beneath it, of course, a description in the Assyrian language. Again, this is the first time these two are meeting, or close to the first time that these two are meeting, the Assyrian words with the ancient images coming together in the 1950s. And of course, this is the first time the Assyrian New Year or the Babylonian New Year is being mentioned in modern Assyrian writing. And Addai Alkhas, of course, translates Enuma Elish from French, translates it into, and he was well versed in French, translates it into very good Assyrian. And he tells us that the tablets speak on the thoughts of the Assyrians. And of course, he refers to it as the Assyrian creation. Sometimes it's referred to as Babylonian creation. He tells us that these were found by Sir Henry Layard and are now in the British Museum. So he lauds the Westerners who discovered these tablets. He places importance on the West for discovering these tablets. He has a high regard, high respect for Westerners who respect his culture and history. And he wants to introduce Assyrians to these names. Again, for the first time, we hear words like Enlil, modern Assyrians, that is, of course, not talking about ancient Assyrians. Now we're talking about us. Enlil, Marduk, Ashur, Ishtar. This is new to the Assyrians. This is not something familiar. So in this magazine, we see this high culture, the creation of a new history for the Assyrians, referring back to the ancient past and using this strange terminology that is going to become, by the 1970s and 80s, rather ordinary. It's going to become much more familiar to the average Assyrian. Well, what was the Enuma Elish? I'm not going to go into the actual ancient tale. That's not the point of this lecture, but it is, of course, a creation story of the early ancient gods. It begins with the primordial gods, Apsu, and it is similar in some ways to the story of creation. It comes, of course, historically, can be dated much earlier. At any rate, it is a story of the battle or conflict of the gods and then the creation of humanity on earth. So it's a very fascinating story. What does it mean? Scholars have been poring over it for many decades. I doubt if anyone has come close to fully understanding it. But it is an ancient Assyrian or Babylonian tale, religious tale, and it is the basis of what we call the Assyrian New Year. And this is the first time, as we said, that this discussion of the Assyrian New Year is taking place 1952. Now, I should go back and discuss one more thing. So we're often asked, where does this exact year come from? 6,700 and something. Where does that come from? How accurate is that? And so I will discuss a bit of that um, next week when we talk about John Alkhas, but I'll just say something now in case you missed that class. How kind of me. Um, this was created, really written by John Alkhas. John Alkhas seems to recall that there is a tablet dated 4,750 years before Christ. He refers to a person who is a historian or an archaeologist. And Nimrod Simono later, many years later, is unhappy with that. And he refers to this reference as questionable. So that the date comes from the reference by John Alkhas 2 or 3 years after the writing of the article by Nimrod Simono. So John Alkhas's article comes after the article that I referenced as to the Assyrian New Year, or Risha Chita Aturai Babilaya, written by Nimrod Simono. So that comes later. And Nimrod Simono, in his writing, in his introduction to the book on John Alkhas, although he's a deep admirer of the literary creations of John Alkhas, again, many people have described John Alkhas as unequaled in literature, although Nimrod Simono, is an admirer of John Alkhas on the one hand. On the other hand, he critiques this idea that the Assyrian New Year has an exact date. All right, we'll leave it there. John Alkhas, Addai Alkhas also translated in various issues the descent of Ishtar into the underworld. This story of the descent of Ishtar, and she goes through this experience, the 7 ordeals and so on and so forth. And we begin to understand in modern Assyrian literature for the first time, we begin to hear these words we've never heard before. الأوبرا اتمنلت أرخت لديارة آلهتا إشتر براتت آلهة سين متولاناتو هي إشتر براتت سين. I mean, for Assyrians to hear that Ishtar was the daughter of the god Sin is something very, very unusual. It is certainly an eye-opener for many in the church, and no doubt there were criticisms of the references to the ancient Assyrian gods. I am sure that up until today, there's an objection to the use of the word alaha, or God, before a certain word like Sin or Alehta, Ishtar, and so on and so forth. So this was exposing the modern Assyrians to these tales, these wondrous tales, these fascinating stories that one could think, oh, this is part of my heritage. This is part of our history. And this ties me to a person who calls himself Chaldean, a person who calls himself Syriac Orthodox, or a person who calls himself Assyrian. This was an attempt to bring people together through the use of this anchor, Assyrianism, and to show them that they should have confidence in themselves, that they have a glorious history. They should stick together as a people. It was an attempt to counter the dispersal and the destruction of the Assyrian people, especially after the First World War. So I won't go again into the story of the descent of Ishtar, but it's a very fascinating story, read in any language. Ishtar descends into the underworld, ruled by her sister, who is a goddess of death in the underworld. And there's a long story here of her triumph in the end. and her rebirth, because that transforms the world. Um, it's a very, very fascinating story, and some people could see parallels in various faiths, including in Christianity, the ideas, anyway, the motifs, and so on. What we also have in this production, Gilgamesh, is um, writings on Saprayuta Suryeta. Of course, whenever the word Suryaya or Suraya is used, there's always a missing Allah, or the silent Allah. And here we have an article written in 1952 in various issues and we are told by Zaya bit Zaya, who is another great writer, great historian and philologist among Assyrians. It's sad to state that Assyrian literature is better known and respected by foreigners than by Assyrians themselves, in particular Assyrians from Iran. He's criticizing the Assyrians from Iran, who are not being very supportive. And what this tells us, what this article, and reading through this article, what I sensed was that although there was great pride in the ancient Assyrian literature and the ancient Assyrian past, there's a great creation here with Zaya bit Zaya in writing several articles. There's a production of Gilgamesh magazine. These men, and some of the women who helped them, of course, men and women who produced these magazines, felt alone oftentimes. They felt unsupported by their people. There was much criticism, not only during the time that they were writing and complaining, something that we hear often when confronted, when nationalists are confronted. For example, Naum Fayed complains of not being supported and being unable to make a living for himself and his family. And so the same with Addai Alkhas and John Alkhas. John Alkhas is thought to be one of the greatest writers, as I said, but he died a poor man. He died a person who was not successful personally. In the words of Yuval Baba, who reprinted many of his works, but it was very sad that he had died a death that was undeserving of a person who was such a literary stalwart, really, among Assyrians. And so Zaya bit Zaya complains, and these complaints come through in various writings. The story of Shamiram and Ninos, or Ninos and Semiramis, is also told. It is translated by Addai Alkhas. That's one of the things he does, is take these old stories that are written in French and other languages and translate them into Assyrian for the very first time, certainly modern Assyrian. In this issue in 1953, he recounts Semiramis as written by Diodorus of Sicily, 60 years before Christ. And he highlights the importance of Assyrian history, really demonstrating that although our history is maybe obscure to many people, there are many educated people, philosophers, and writers in history who revere Assyrian history and who write at length about it. And again, the importance of bringing Assyrian language, modern Assyrian language, with these ancient images, as you see here, a rather romantic picture of Queen Semiramis in battle in her chariot. Also, John Alkhas with Addai Alkhas translates many writings. So one of the things that he does is translate the writings of Tiglath-Pileser from 1100 BC. He introduces modern Assyrians to the style and phraseology of the ancient Assyrians, something that may have seemed very strange early on, but now is becoming more commonplace. Of course, later, after people begin to read these sources, I am positive that when Assyrians began to read this modern Assyrian writing with these strange words like Tiglath-Pileser and Marduk and Ashur and Nergil and Tiamat, and seeing these images associated with this language for the first time was quite a shock, possibly. We have articles in Gilgamesh also that refer to the Aramaic language, Lishana Aramaya. This is, of course, after the death of Addai Alkhas. The magazine went on for a few years, a couple of years. We are told, although our language is Aramaic, Aramaya by Nimrod Simono, that the language comes from Akkadian, the language of Assyrian Babylon, and father Babit Lishana Shimaya of Semitic languages, the father of Semitic languages. So there's this constant pride in ancient Assyrian history, this constant referring to the links to ancient Assyrian history and greatness. There's also articles on persons who deserve to be praised, and one of those persons, according to Addai Alkhas in 1952, is the great William Daniel. We're told that William Daniel is truly a man truly worthy of praise. Midget Sheikh al-Khukra, he has struggled for years for us as a musician, well versed with his art. Amnute, he could have worked for other nations, but this young man, honorable and committed, has not forgotten his nation. He has composed a few sweet melodies, based upon the foundation he has found maintained among the mountain historians, or mountain Assyrians, excuse me, mountain historians. I'm thinking of Asahel Grant here. These he has reframed into songs formulated through musical rules into new songs. So there is this obsession of Assyrians, and we'll see it again and again in this class. I'll refer to it, that we should also be like others. We are like others. We just got to discover it. We do have music. We do have songs. We do have literature. We do have a history. We do have a powerful language. We just have to rediscover it. This one sees in the writings of Naum Fayek, of Addai Alkhas, of Zaya Bidzaya, of others, Mishael Lazar Isa, we'll talk about in the coming weeks, and others. We have literature, we just have to work at it. So he tells us that these songs he has reframed into songs formulated through musical rules, قانون موسيقي, into new songs, Mariata Khate. We Assyrians, other than some melodies and church hymns left to us in our churches, we have no songs to be sung at a party, zuyacha, or wedding, chlula, he tells us, Addai Alkhas tells us. And now for the first time, we can take pride that we too have our songs. We too are a nation, and we too have music and folklore and so on. There's also a constant romantic look at the past, a reverence for the past and for the Assyrian lands. And even though they are not politically possessed by Assyrians, there is this poetic look at our culture, our ancient culture, and our tie to this land. So there's a constant reference to Assyrians being travelers, aruqe or khadure, or chazuqe, travelers in the world. So one writing by John Alkhas, I thought we will deal more in the future with it, but it kind of portrays the way that these men looked at their land and at their history. He tells us, "O traveler, when you arrive here to this plain of Bitnahran, Dishtat Bitnahran, be careful, vihishir. For every step you take, you will touch the steps taken by persons 1, 3, 7, 9,000 years before Christ. And if you seek to go to the depths of history, you will find creation, the very idea, the very creation of the world. In other words, it is centered here. O traveler, know that you have been created from the soil and its waters. As those who lived here were made of the soil mixed with the blood of the gods, dimmet alehe. And so every step that you take, do it in silence and with honor. Vihishir, walk very carefully and with honor. إقارة وشهارة. 1954, very important development in the formation of this linking of modern Assyrians to the ancient past through this romantic literary vision. Now, among other items in this magazine were the article defending Assyrians. This was a constant theme among Assyrians, is to defend the reputation of the ancient Assyrians against the claims of many people who, in the thoughts of the defenders like Rabbi Addai Alkhas, were misinterpreting biblical history. And so one article that was written in the Assyrian Star in 1955 was by an Assyrian preacher who had written it under the title The Greatest Cause of Our Failure, and it was in November of 1955. And this article basically said that the Assyrians were fierce and cruel, and they destroyed cities and they mistreated prisoners. Therefore, concluded this article, our empire's sun set forever. In other words, we're done as a nation, we are finished, and there is no coming back from the greatest sin ever committed by our nation, in as recorded by the Old Testament, according to this particular preacher. And in an article, Penna Purley, who is related to David Purley, was the daughter of David Purley, wrote a critique, a searing critique of the preacher's thoughts and ideas, and basically demonstrated in an analytical way in this article that was originally featured in the Assyrian Star, that was translated and published in the Gilgamesh magazine, that the preacher was wrong in his thinking, that the Assyrian Empire was not simply an entity that engaged in cruel conduct, ruthless conduct for no reason, but the Assyrians were interested in maintaining order and so on and so forth. In other words, defending the ancient Assyrians. And Addai Alkhas, Rabbi Addai Alkhas notes at the end of the article that the article of the young lady, Miss Purley, though a bit personal, parsupaya, he says, is built on a truth that cannot be denied. We believe that it will be an awakening to those that think they can add to their personal honor by placing blame and blackening the name and history of their ancestors. So this expression of people like Addai Alkhas and Nimrod Simono and John Alkhas was that our ancestors were great. Do not denigrate them. Do not, for your own personal benefit, degrade your ancestors. In her high-minded thinking, he says of Miss Purley, she has shown that she is a fine example for other young Assyrians. And in this magazine, we also have various entertaining issues. We have stories that came from French writers that were translated by Martuma Odu in his tale, 100 Tales. He writes a story of a Piqqa and Tawirta, which we heard in growing up in school, the frog that tries to become a cow and so on and explodes. And so all these children's stories are sometimes reproduced, but also reproduced is a reverence for Assyrian food. So there's kind of a reverence for Assyrian culture. We also have our food. And here we have one of the favorites, I'm sure, of many of you, harissa, Bichmul Bet Kolya. He writes about the various celebrations where harissa is made and talks about it being made and so on and so forth, and takes a lot of pride in the creation of harissa. In 1988, a great effort was taken, which came to realization in 1992, which was to reproduce various articles of not the pictures, not the images, and not the graphics that were in the magazine, but the writings, the articles. And this was a fantastic effort taken by Daniel Benyamin and Yuel Baba in particular, and Pilimun Darmu. And I felt it's very interesting, and it speaks to the dispersal of the Assyrians that Numrud Simono, who was the last left, who has also passed away, passed the torch to Daniel Benyamin, who lived in the United States and who used to publish the Assyrian Academic Journal, or Journal of the Assyrian Academic Society. Later, it became the Journal of Assyrian Academic Studies. And he printed this book along with Filimun Darmu, with the support of Mr. Yuel Baba, who's in California. So Daniel Benyamin was in Chicago. Yuel Baba was in California. Filimun Darmu was in Australia. Nimrud Simono was in Iran. Boy, if that doesn't speak to the state of the Assyrian people in a very poignant and powerful and painful way, I think nothing will. So he passed this effort gave him all the rights to Gilgamesh, and it was reprinted. And this volume, and I should tell you, if you don't have it, I think everyone should have a copy of this. I believe, not plugging here, but I believe it's available at the Ashurbanipal Library. You can check with Sarah later. But let me go back and just tell you that this was a very important accomplishment in 1992 when these articles were published, 40 years after the demise, or after the start, excuse me, of the magazine, 30 years after its demise. Nimrod Simono, who again knew the language, knew that there was no greater effort at Assyrian literature than was taken in these 10 years by the efforts of men like Addai Alkhas, Rabbi Addai Alkhas, and his brother Nimrod Simono. And his brother, excuse me, and along with Nimrod Simono, Zaya Bidzaya, and others. No greater effort. This was the greatest literary magazine. I don't think anything has come before or after that matches the golden production that was Gilgamesh. We are told by Yuel Baba, who, by the way, all of these men have passed away. I think Filimun Darmu is still alive, if I'm not mistaken, but Nimrod Simono, God rest his soul, has passed away. So has Daniel Benyamin, so has Yuel Baba. And so this is a very sad reading, really. But he says in his tribute here, in a short biography he writes of these men, other periodicals were not equal to Gilgamesh, as they served a purpose other than the love of our nation and literature. So he's referring to, for example, Zarirat Bahra, Urmi Orthodoxet, and other Khalid Shrar and others published by non-Assyrian entities for the purpose of spreading denominationalism among Assyrians. Gilgamesh, however, was run by Assyrian nationalists, Umtanaya Aturai. I feel my inadequacy, he tells us, in comparison to the greatness of the two brothers, Addai Alkhas and John Alkhas, and Nimrod Simono, their helper. So they've left us with this legacy, and I think it's very important. Today, we skimmed over some of the details, and I want to tell you a little bit about what I think this magazine produced, my analysis of what was this magazine all about. It created a very strong link between modern Assyrian language and ancient Assyrian words, names, themes, stories, and history. This was the first time such a production was had. It brought symbols, images, and scenes from the ancient Assyrian past with modern Assyrian words into the Assyrian mind, to the modern Assyrian mind, so that when we see these images of Assyrian soldiers or Assyrian kings, we feel, oh, this is our culture, our past, our heritage, our history. familiarized modern Assyrians with a vocabulary that was within the orbit of Western scholars only. So remember, we talked about John Alkhas reproducing the writings of, translating the writings of Tiqlet Pulezar, Addai Alkhas's productions in Enuma Elish and other writings. These were all new to the Assyrians in 1952 when Gilgamesh was created. It uplifted the confidence of the Assyrians after the devastation of their lands, their people, their culture, their language, their churches, and their collective history by reviving the greatness of ancient Assyria. Where there was instability in the modern Assyrian mind of the present, there was stability and greatness in the Assyrian past. It celebrated the culture of both modern and ancient Assyrians through poetry and storytelling. Again, for the first time, we see these references come about. Strive to nativize the Assyrian language or purify it by teaching native words instead of foreign borrowed words, and inspired a collective reawakening among the Assyrians as to their past. And for this reason, we definitely should view Addai Alkhas as the father of modern Assyrian literary movement.